Okaidi, welcome back to my channel, Made Between the Pages. My name is Taylor, and today we have another wonderful episode of Page Chewing. I am joined, of course, by my co-host, PL Stewart. Steve can't be with us today; he has, work calls. But our lovely guest today is none other but Tessa Gratton, who is a New York Times best-selling author. For many, many different works, both in YA and adult, and we're delighted to have her. If you wouldn't mind, though, just giving those watching a little bit of a self introduction of who you are and how you found yourself where you are in the industry today.
Sure. I am Tessa Gratton. I am the author of predominantly young adult fantasy novels, but I've also written several adult fantasy novels, which is what I grew up reading and loving the most. My books have been translated into 22 different languages, and my debut came out in 2011. So I've been doing this professionally for just over a decade and full time for about 10 years. I live in Kansas on the edge of the prairie with my wife and some really weird cats. But I grew up living all over the world because my father was in the US Navy. And so we were stationed in all kinds of places, including Japan. Um, yeah, I love all things magic. When I was little, I wanted to be a wizard more than anything else, and I've been kind of chasing that my whole life. And writing stories is the closest I've come to creating magic.
I love that because stories are magic,
Yeah,
It's
they
how
can
we can
be.
create
Yeah.
it's how we can create that in the mundane, right?
Mhm.
So, just hearing from your introduction there, I'm sure there's a lot of things that have inspired your works, over the years. But one thing that strikes me is the breadth of what you've done in all of the different genres and all of the different inspirations that you've had, from Shakespeare to Star Wars to you name it. And I'm wondering if when you approach a story, is there a different way that you approach a story knowing it's going to be in a specific genre or age group? So you mentioned both YA and adult. You grew up reading adult when you were young. I think a lot of us got away with reading books we shouldn't have been reading when we were younger.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, when you approach a story, do you approach it from the genre or the age group that you're going for? Or does it naturally just kind of develop into one of those what's the word I'm looking for? Categories on its own.
Sure. The On a basic level, every story that I want to write, when an idea grows enough that I think it's a viable idea, it's something where, okay, I know I can make a whole book out of this idea. That usually comes with the category, the age category. Like I know at that point, am I aiming for a young adult audience or am I aiming for an adult audience with this? Like, what does the idea call for? What audience am I really interested in asking questions to, like directed at? But that said, when I first started trying to be a published writer, I specifically focused on young adult ideas and teenage ideas because that's why I wanted to be a published writer, was to write stories for uh, teenagers and young adults. I was actually going to school for politics. I was in graduate school. I fully intended to become like a feminist lobbyist, like really deep into intersectional feminism and lobbying and how to make structural change in America specifically. And I was in graduate school in 2004, 2005. It was the like kind of the height of the Iraq War. And George W. Bush was elected again. And my dad was in the province of Iraq serving with the Marines that had the highest death rate for the US service members. And I was in a really fraught place and was getting just angrier and angrier. And I realized that the path I was on was actually just turning me into an angry and maybe even like kind of aggressive bad person. I only fought, I only argued. I didn't really know how to create relationships that would actually lead to change. And I quit graduate school and thought to myself, okay, what was my actual goal here? That was making the world better. That's what I'd wanted to do for at least 10 years. I knew that's what I wanted to do was make the world a more equitable, just place. And how could I do that if not politics? Like that's how you're supposed to do that, right? And I thought to myself, okay, well, what made me realize that the world needed people to fight for justice? What made me want to make the world better? And the real answer was the way I was raised, which of course I can't give to everyone. And then also the books I read when I was like 10 to 15 years old. And so I thought, oh, well, I've always loved writing. I've always been a writer, but what if I could pivot and do that as my calling, my work and write books that can help other 10 to 15-year-olds realize that the world is in danger and we need to be fighting things like transphobia and structural racism and all these things. How can I tell stories and write them? And so I got into this job intending to write for a young adult audience first. Like that is what I was here for. And my first 6 or 7 books were YA books before I was like, okay, you can have a break and you can write a fun adult sexy Shakespeare retelling.
Allow it, right?
Yeah, right, right. You've earned it a little bit.
Oh, I love that. I love that origin story and how, I feel like writing is almost a calling. A lot of people talk about it as that. And it's really interesting to hear how you came to the space that you're in now. And something that also really strikes me with the work that you do is almost all of it is either queer normative or mm, queer normative adjacent or talks about those issues, right? So I think that when you come to your works with that in mind, it definitely comes through the page. I think you're very successful in getting that through to the audience.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And I think for someone like Taylor who knows me, I'm still kind of giddy because this is a huge fanboy moment for me. I think Tessa knows that I'm a huge fan of your work. You can forgive me for a minute while I do some cover flashing because the
Yes.
covers are gorgeous. Right, the covers are gorgeous. The Innis Lear, Queens of Innis Lear duology, Queens of Innis Lear, and of course Lady Hotspur.
Yep.
These are gorgeous covers and fantastic books. If you'll indulge me, Tessa, why Shakespeare? Why a Shakespeare retelling? What led you to write this duology?
So I ultimately wrote The Queens of Innis Lear because I think Shakespeare's play King Lear sucks. It is considered to be like his ultimate work. It was one of the last plays he wrote. And basically, for 400 years, that not that long, there was about 100 years where people forgot about King Lear. But in general, it is really touted as like the ultimate in theatrical writing. And it is like you're not a successful old white man in acting if you haven't played King Lear. Like it is the ultimate thing to play. And so many of the lines are famous and the storm, like it's just very iconic. And wow, I read it when I was 17 or 18 and I was really upset about it because I had read a bunch of Shakespeare plays before that and seen a bunch of them and performed in some of them. And I really felt like Shakespeare kind of had my back because he wrote really complicated, marginalized characters, openly marginalized characters. And I was just like, wow, even though there's a lot of like problematic things, of course, um, there was someone writing who at least gave space to the pain of marginalized characters, women, and there's a lot of queerness, very overt in Shakespeare, and non-white cultures. I mean, just a surprising amount. And then I read King Lear, and every single character except for King Lear and the Fool is like two-dimensional. The women are the most two-dimensional, flat out evil women that he wrote in the 40 years of writing before that. I was just stunned and horrified, and I was like, wow, F you, Shakespeare. um, and it took, so that was when I was 17, and I thought every once in a while, I should write a YA King Lear. I should fix this. I should do this better because not Elia, that's my character's name. Cordelia, the youngest of Lear's daughters, is just really shafted in particular. Um, and she only exists to further Lear's character arc. And I came back to it every once in a while and was like, it's Cordelia and Edmund the bastard. These are the two most interesting characters. And I got to do this. And every once in a while, I would sort of like chew on the idea and realize it just wasn't there yet. I didn't ultimately understand why I should care about Cordelia in particular. And then in 2014, um, I had a book series canceled by my publisher. It was during the Penguin Random House merger when Random House bought Penguin. And I was at Random House at the time in the middle of a trilogy called The United States of Asgard, which is in print now because I got the rights back and self-published it. So you can go read it anywhere that books are sold. um, but I really had been treated very well by Random House children's books, where they published my first two novels and then this trilogy. And the third book in the trilogy was done. And I thought that we were getting on a phone call to talk about what my next books were going to be. And instead, the phone call was actually, we're not going to publish this book at all anymore. And this is something that happens to authors all the time, unfortunately. It is very like business as usual for publishing, but I was crushed and betrayed because it seemed like it came out of nowhere to me. And I felt like I'd given everything, I'd done everything right, and then it still wasn't going to happen. I was betrayed. And it was maybe like, I don't know, 6 or 7 weeks after this conversation, and for whatever reason, King Lear came back up, and I thought to myself, "Oh, oh, oh, I understand Cordelia. I actually have a window into her emotional reality now." And as soon as I realized that, like this whole book just kind of unfurled itself in my imagination. And so that's why King Lear and Shakespeare, I decided to write the story that I wanted King Lear to be, where every character was three-dimensional and mostly selfish and bad. Like, I didn't want to make everybody good. Most of them are still bad guys, but I was really invested in exploring how that could happen to a family and a kingdom, and like the relationship between like structural power, the ruling class, and their emotional like family issues, also like everything that I've always been invested in. and it turned into this huge, sprawling, epic fantasy novel. Yeah.
Yeah, one that is, may I say, absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
Certainly in my top 50 books, both of them of all time, and certainly my top duology ever. I guess, of course, duologies now, I think they're a bit, I mean, there was a time when, if I look through a lot of the fantasy titles, there were very few duologies.
Mhm.
I'm not saying it's so pervasive now, but
Yeah.
there are more than before, and this is just fantastic. So,
Yeah.
um, so a question, Tessa. So with one thing I love about your series is obviously the gender inversion and own voices. You inject that feeling of magic and mystery that I think Shakespeare was trying to capture. You have all these unique characters, and you still have you draw us into this world of prophecy and divided loyalties and destiny. But the one thing that I will say, and this is, again, this is only a compliment, is that your prose, wow, it is so lush, it's so evocative, it's got, I can only describe it as dreamy. And so when you think of Shakespeare, obviously we're talking about, we have to keep in mind in the context of the time that he wrote in.
Mhm.
But I mean, your prose is just, it so suits for me something that is inspired by Shakespeare's plays. So what was that a conscious effort to make the prose somewhat elevated because it was Shakespeare? Was that something that you were striving for?
I really appreciate you using the word elevated. Um,
PL is a prose snob, so that is a huge, huge compliment.
so I really appreciate that. I tried very hard to feel the way to feel about the way that I wrote The Queens of Lear, the way I feel when I read and recite my favorite Shakespeare lines and soliloquies. I think that Shakespeare was like a linguistic genius. And I think that he mostly was just writing the way that he thought and the way that his imagination worked, and that he was a poet above all. And he brought this like sense, like, he basically invented it, like a shocking number of words in the English language. I think I don't know. I'm just gonna make this up, but I feel like I read at some point that it's like something like 10% of the English language can be traced to either directly to a word that he used for the first time in his plays, or he invented a word, and then because English is a very improvisational language, we did the same thing to other words that he did for the first time. And so when I think about Shakespeare's writing, I think of rhythm and playfulness. Those are the key words that I have with everything I love. And even his most tragic, beautiful soliloquies are still playful. And that's what I tried to keep in mind when I was writing. And to be honest, I let myself indulge myself. And I usually try not to do that because I'm a long writer and an overwriter. And so I struggle to keep even YA books under 100,000 words. um, because I just like to live in playful poetry. But when I was writing in the Queens of Lear, I was like, you know what? This is your chance. Just go for it. And so it's a very indulgent, in a lot of ways, book for me because I didn't hold myself back very much, even in a few places where arguably I should have.
When you say that you wanted it to have the same cadence and the playfulness.
Mhm.
Did you find that you were reading back to yourself out loud was an important part of that process? Because I find that if I say something out loud, it hits different than if you read
Mhm.
it.
Yes, definitely. And I read it out loud differently. I try to read as much of all of my books as possible out loud when I get to like the line edit and copy edit level. That's the best place to figure out, oh, I really need a comma here, or an indication of this is where you would take a break if you were telling this story. Um, with the Queens of Innis Lear in particular, um, I let myself get into a more performative space. I spent a lot of my high school. I was a theater nerd, and so I actively tried to be in that theater nerd space when I was reading Queens of Innis Lear to myself. Especially, I tried really hard with the dialogue in particular, and then some of the longer, more dreamy descriptions. Yeah, that broke down a little bit with Lady Hotspur just because of timeline and things that were going on in my life. I didn't have as much time to work on it. And so, yeah, I wish I could have a year now to like revise Lady Hotspur just for the things that I got to do with Queens that I didn't get to do with Hotspur. And that's just a publishing reality, unfortunately.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Did you feel any pressure, conscious or subconscious, you think, Tessa, because obviously it's a retelling of this incredibly iconic writer that the entire world knows. So now you're doing this retelling, and again, very inventive, especially with the characters and the gendered version. But did you feel the pressure because, after all, this is Shakespeare that's inspiring you, and you're rewriting one of two, essentially more than two,
Mhm.
three and a half of
Yeah.
his plays.
Um, So I would have answered this question differently 2 years ago. I would have said, yes, I felt some pressure. But now that I've written three and I'm working on my fourth Star Wars, I gotta say, I feel way more pressure writing Star Wars novels than I did with the Shakespeare. And on one hand, I think that's because Shakespeare is constantly adapted. There have been, 5 King Lear adaptations big enough that I've seen them in the last 15 years. And then people are doing Shakespeare, like King Lear, constantly every year and interpreting it and reinterpreting it. And so I think that there's an expectation with Shakespeare that it will be adapted and it will be changed, and we will find new ways to explore these stories and these characters. So I put pressure on myself when I was working on them, but I don't actually think there was very much external pressure. And certainly the people who directly engaged with me about Queens and Hotspur were very open about wanting to engage with my interpretation. And there was not really no pushback about it. Um, yeah. So, and then now that I work for Star Wars, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a really active legacy that people have a lot of strong opinions about. And I'm working with characters who were created by my peers in the last 4 years as opposed to 400 years ago. And so that's where the real pressure lies, I think, um, with creating essentially new canon as opposed to an adaptation of something where there's arguably no such thing as canon when it comes to Shakespeare, because he even had there were the folios and all the different things, and the plays we have where somebody wrote them down at some point, but we don't actually know how accurate they are to the words that were performed on the stage the first time or the last time, like all that kind of stuff. So Shakespeare was always dynamic.
It's a really important point, I think, too, is also the relevancy of the time today,
Mhm.
right? So Star Wars, like you said, is very much, it's dynamic, but in a different way. It's dynamic as in
Yes.
it's still growing and still being
Mhm.
created, whereas Shakespeare is dynamic in almost a retroactive form. So I
Mhm.
think that's a really good point that you make. And I'm sure that there's both joy and frustration. Let's use the word frustration
Yeah.
with the fandoms of today, especially with the on, I think the internet has also really
Mhm.
developed fandoms to be juggernauts, and
Yes.
they will make their thoughts known.
Yes.
Fandoms will make them
The
known.
Star Wars readers have all been completely fantastic, I will say. Like all every time I've brushed against less pleasant Star Wars fandom areas, they're not readers. It's not about the books. It's and so that is nice. Like the particularly I work on the High Republic era, and I've never seen anything with the High Republic readers and fans other than just like joy and excitement and really like invested critique. I don't like where they're like, oh, we really want this to be good. Let's talk about how we wish it had been better. Like that is the angle of the kind of critique. So yeah. I'm happy in the books area. I know there are a lot of Star Wars writers that would love to move into other media, and that is I'm not one of them.
That's amazing. Well, of course, we should probably talk a little bit about Star Wars because
Sure.
Quest for Planet X is a New York Times bestseller. Congratulations.
Thank
So,
you.
why Star Wars in particular? Out of all of the, I mean, we have in terms of science fiction universes, there's so many. What attracted you to Star Wars?
Oh gosh. Well, I um don't remember a time in my life that Star Wars wasn't a part of my life. My parents are huge Star Wars fans. I was born right after or right before The Empire Strikes Back came out. And but my parents loved A New Hope. And one of my earliest memories, I was like 3 or 4, was going to the drive-through and mom and dad were watching Return of the Jedi, and I was in the back of the van playing with my little brother because we didn't care. So we were just, playing with our toys. And I looked up for whatever reason and I was like, "Are those teddy bears? I think those are teddy bears," and like crawled up to the front and ignored my little brother because I was obsessed with the Ewoks. I thought they were teddy bears. Um, and so like that is one of my most formative memories was becoming actually obsessed with Wicket, and I dressed up like him. I had like Ewok pajamas. There were probably teddy bear pajamas that my mom told me were Ewok pajamas. So it was like my first cosplay when I was 4. I stopped answering to my name and only answered to Wicket. Like, those kind of preschool shenanigans. And as I got older, I gravitated toward Princess Leia because she had incredibly beautiful hair. I will admit it was definitely a shallow initial attraction. Carrie Fisher's face and her hair. But I really learned a lot about myself from Princess Leia and how she led and what she wanted and how she built relationships while still fighting for justice. And so, in a lot of ways, I never chose Star Wars because it was just always there and always a part of my family life and things that taught me about fantasy. Even though there's spaceships and stuff, Star Wars, the original trilogy in particular, is a fantasy trilogy. um, and so, yeah, that on one hand is the answer. And on the other hand, when it comes to actually writing professionally for these kind of big IPs, for the most part, they choose you. Authors don't have enough power in general to be like, yes, I would like to write a Star War. May I have one, please? That's unfortunately not how it works. And I got to do this because of my very good friend and co-writer Justina Ireland. We've been friends for like 8 years now, and she was one of the initial writers creating the High Republic. And it's because of her that I got my invitation. She knew I loved Star Wars. We'd written together before, and beta read for each other, and she trusted me, for which I'll always be happy and grateful to co-write a book with her. And so that is how it happened for me, was um, relationships, and like having, I'd been a writer for 10 years already, so I had a good backlist. So yeah.
That's incredible. What is it like to co-author a book with another writer? As a writer myself, we've heard all kinds of stories. These collaborations, these partnerships. Sometimes they work fantastic. Sometimes there's issues.
Mhm.
But regardless, so Chaos and Flame. That's I guess the best known collaboration you
Mhm.
have with Justina. And also, can you tell us a bit about it while you're at it? But what's it like to do the collaboration, the co-writing?
Sure. It's different. I've talked to a lot of different co-authors now. And it's different for everyone. For Justina and I, it really happened because we talk about writing constantly. We're always talking to each other about what we're working on and being like, oh, I can't figure out this character arc, or like I'll read one of her books early and give her feedback and vice versa. Excuse me. And we also knew that we have similar taste in YA in particular, like what we want from YA and the kind of fun we want to have in YA. Was really the main reason we decided to work on this together. Justina and I both our individual novels are always grappling with hard issues. I really am looking at things like choice and gender. Gender trouble, and structural transphobia and that kind of stuff, and trying to deal with that. And Justina writes about historical racism and modern racism. And, so our individual books are really hard to write. We're trying to make a difference. We're trying to challenge readers and also invite them in and have a good time. And it can be a very fraught process. And so we hit this point where Justina is the one who was like, we really should just write a fun book. Can we just write a book that's not hard? It's not about anything except fun. And, we'll put some dragons in it and kissing and whatever, it'll be great. And I was like, that sounds so nice. Um, and we talked about that for a while, just like knocking ideas around and trying to put things together. And we kept ruining our ideas with like real world issues. And we were like, oh no, we can't do that one. That's too important. That's going to be hard emotionally to write. We need to get back to something fun, and that's it. And Justina called me one day. It was January of 2020, and she says, I you're gonna make fun of me for this, but I know what book we have to write because I had a dream about it. And I said, just like Stephanie Meyer, it's a sign. Because Stephanie Meyer notoriously had a dream about what became Twilight. And so we went on a retreat together, and like just banged out an outline. We were just having a great time. It was silly. And then about 8 days after that retreat, the lockdown happened for COVID. And we were just like, oh no, well, now we have to write this book because everything is terrible. The world is terrible. We can't write anything serious because we're all in like existential agony every day. And so we started writing Chaos and Flame, which is like a really fun and ferocious YA enemies to lovers fantasy about an assassin from House Kraken who is intent on revenge against House Dragon because House Dragon massacred her original house and made her an orphan. And that is Darling. And then Talon is the other main character, and he is the war prince of House Dragon. And he really is tired of war. And he meets Darling and they fight, but Talon recognizes her because his older brother, who is the High Prince Regent, has been painting pictures of Darling since he was about 8 years old. And they just thought it was, that Caspian, the older brother, was mad. That prophecy had driven him mad, but actually this is a real person. And so Talon kidnaps Darling instead of killing her. And it's political shenanigans ensue and lots of fighting and kissing and monsters and all of the really fun stuff. It's a super fun book, I promise. It's not about anything serious except for, war and the consequences of war.
Well,
I didn't even answer your question, but
no, I think you did. I think you did.
Okay, good.
The idea of co-writing with someone, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And something that really struck me just from that story there and just what you've talked about thus far is that there's kind of two ways to approach taking on real world issues. There is the queer normative route, just if we're talking about LGBTQIA plus issues, but in any issue really. But there's the normative route where you have the power to, in your story, create a world where something is not an issue and explore what that would be like. And then there's also the approach that I know PL takes as well in his work, where he attacks it head on and says, this is an issue and we need to discuss it as the issue that it is. So I'm curious for you, when you're deciding which approach to take with which issues in your stories, is there something like a guiding factor to know which way you'd like to approach a certain issue in your work?
I mostly write secondary world fantasies. And so when I'm doing that, I get to create a world from the ground up. And I feel that it's very important to show readers that it's possible to have a world where it is not fraught to be gay, or there are all kinds of different possibilities for genders. You can have a world where they've always believed there are 7 genders normally, or, so right now, I always lean toward some kind of normativity when I'm doing world building. I think that is it's something that I can do, and a lot of writers aren't like their mission is different. And so I feel like because it's something I can do and something I believe in, that's a really good, important space for me to occupy because I can still tell stories that are, full of conflict and about being queer or genderqueer, but it starts from a different place on the like political spectrum. And I do feel like in some ways, because I can do that, I have to do that. And, sexual queerness and gender queerness are very different. Like they're related, obviously. But, you know, it has been very interesting. my book Night Shine that came out in 2020, I think. Um, that sounds right.
What even
Um,
is time, right?
right, right. So that book, I specifically wanted to build a world where magic was non-binary. And like the most powerful people were the people who could access non-binary liminal spaces, not just when it comes to gender or sexuality, but also, night and day and life and death. Like, so there are a lot of metaphorical ways you can introduce the idea of non-binariness. And so in that world, because I knew that was going to be my focus, the sexuality is very like queer sexuality is very normative. Nobody cares if you're gay or bi or pan or ace or lesbian or any of those things. What they care about is the gender you present, is that duality. They care about if you're a witch or a priest. They care if you're a man or a woman, a boy or a girl. They care if you're alive or dead. Like, literally, spirits are alive and demons are dead. Like, so I built a lot of dualities into it, but in order to make that more pointed, it was better to make sexuality a spectrum, to point out like that kind of thing. So on a certain level, it really depends on what the main point and main conflict of the story is and who the characters are. Um, so I think it's two layered. Like, ideally, I'm looking at creating a normative world because I think that blows people's minds still. Like, so many people can't even imagine, either because their imagination has been quashed by our culture or because they're in so much pain. Like, a 14 or 15-year-old who is afraid and in danger. I like being able to present them with a fantasy world where if they are who they are, they wouldn't be in danger. Like, they can access all these different things and be welcomed and embraced, um, because of what they want, not because of who they are. So I'm pretty invested in that. And then secondarily, it depends on the story.
Absolutely. Do you find, Tessa, that, and it's fascinating to hear you talk about the desire to, hey, you know what, written these heavy books, time to write something light and fanciful and funny and just, you know, I know that for me, one thing that I've struggled with as an author is, you know, as Taylor mentioned, I tend to tackle some heavy themes in my books. There's always that point where I wonder, and if someone may love and really enjoy my book, that they may appreciate the themes, but that's not what they're reading for. They're reading it for the world building and the
Mhm.
battle scenes, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And that's great. But at the same time, sometimes perhaps it's not the themes are necessarily lost on them, but that's not their focus. And then, of course, for some people, and every reader is different, and it's
Mhm.
reading is a very subjective thing. For some people, that is the focus. That is why they read my books. Do you find that when it comes to books that are heavier in themes that you've written, that there is sometimes a tendency to perhaps for some readers to kind of not necessarily overlook but gloss over the themes and look for the entertainment value, and or vice versa, to really hone in on those themes, and how do you feel about, well, you know what, I think it's okay because even if someone doesn't necessarily hone in on those themes, they're still enjoying my book. Like, how do you feel about that kind of dichotomy?
Um, I, on one hand, really, I mean, I write books because I want to explore themes with really like dynamic characters. And so I do really want readers to, like, my ideal reader at least understands the questions that I'm asking and gets that the knives I'm, stabbing them with are theme knives. But I also, um, you know, when I read a book, I have to be enjoying myself or I won't get to the end. And so I really try to, I guess my my heaviest thematic works um have been my least read works in a lot of ways. Not the adult books, but when it comes to YA, the harder I have pushed um on theme in, and in the world building and everything, I think the less good I am at communicating a good story. And that's something I'm working on as a writer. Like, I'm trying to get better at it. I'm trying to find ways to communicate what I'm doing in a way that readers respond to and really want to keep turning the pages. And so I really want both. I want readers to enjoy the excitement. And, fantasy isn't fantasy if you don't have like battles or dragons or some kind of like magical murder or whatever. Like, we have all these tropes, and I would like to learn to use those tropes more effectively to tell stories where 20% of it is like, okay, but did you get the point? you know I hope you feel a lot of things. I do think that I was more successful with that in Queens of Innisleer and Lady Hotspur, partly because I am a long writer and I have the space in adult, like the literal word count space in adult, to take my time building the kind of conflict and theme and relationships to get to that point, while also doing, big plot and exciting adventure and, awful magic and all these kind of things. There's room for 10 different layers in the kind of adult fantasy that I've written, that for a lot of real reasons, you just can't tell stories that way in YA, which is not a criticism of YA. It's just a difference in tropes and, category requirements and what kids are looking for and what they want, and the kind of books that librarians and teachers and parents can most easily give to their kids. So I really love YA and am trying to find how to balance that better, like how to, oh, well, I only get 3 layers instead of 8. So how do I, pick what layers I'm going to weave in and how, and prioritize fun communication without losing the thread of. That's one of the reasons I really love working with Justina, is because I think that she nails that in Dread Nation and Deathless Divide. Those books are just like rip roaring adventures. When you start them, can't put them down. The voice is amazing. Things are constantly happening, but you cannot look away from what those books are about. And she's just so good at that. And so that's one of those things I really want to like glean from her to make my individual books better. Yeah.
I think it's very important to talk about the different delivery as well, in YA and
Mhm.
adult, because as someone who is now, I'm 30, so I have officially aged out of who YA is written for. But I find that as an adult, I still enjoy it, but I have to go in knowing it's not written for me anymore, if that
Mhm.
makes sense. So I'm actually pregnancy brain is a real thing. So I'm having some issues with adult fantasy right now with all of those layers we just discussed. So I'm actually
Mhm.
revisiting some older YA books at the moment, but I'm having to remind myself that when I'm annoyed that where are the parents in this story, it's like they're not supposed to be there, right? So
Yep.
it's even as a reader, it's a very interesting experience to go into those two
Mhm.
different age groups. And it's just fascinating to hear as a writer that you also have to kind of think through that, and get
Mhm.
in the right headspace for it. Because as a reader, I have to as well. I have to kind of
Yeah.
reset a little bit.
Mhm.
Hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. So just this may sound like an odd question, but I can imagine you're probably extremely well read. You can't read everything. I know I certainly can't. I'm just so enraptured by the depth and breadth of writing today in 2023 and
Mhm.
all the different genres and subgenres and things you can read. Things as you're talking about, especially in the queer space. What do you feel if there's anything we're missing or there should be more of in literature, speculative fiction specifically right now? Where is there an absence? Where is there a dearth of something that we should be reading more of, seeing more of? Like what's missing? Especially keeping in mind that right now we have places, for example, United States, where the schools where books are being banned, unfortunately,
Mhm.
which is sad. I don't want to get to the whole political aspect there, but what are we missing right now? What would you like to see more of? More authors write more of?
Oh gosh. You know, I have never not been able to find what I'm looking for. If I want something, I can ask a couple of friends or I can ask Twitter and I'll get, 20 suggestions and three of them are in the realm of what I'm looking for. um, I I really think that uh, you know, I want more fantasy and science fiction by non-straight white, able voices. Um, and I can't there are already enough of those that I can only read those, but they aren't getting to the levels where they're household names, where people are, they know what I'm talking about when I say those kind of things. I would, that's really what needs to happen is we need to get those authors, marginalized voices to the level where, I can mention it to my dad and he's heard of them. He's very well read. And that would be really great. I have read a bunch of books in translation recently, and I think it would be great if more people read more translated books. I did that in college a lot, and I credit those professors who didn't just give us Western English speaking writers, but they gave us translations with the reason that I can actually world build well. I grew up reading incredibly built Western science fiction and fantasy, but I was also lucky enough to read uh, Latin American fantasy and African fantasy in translation in particular, just because I lucked into professors who were like, this is where you can find it. And it's so much easier to find and access those things. And I think that those are the kinds of that literature that comes from a totally different place is so it can be so mind blowing on a line level. And especially if you're aware of, oh, this was written in a totally different language that functions very different from English, and then translated into English, and it's still really good and affecting. So that's already like 3 layers of linguistic dynamism, like, and so that's what I would say is I think, particularly aspiring writers, but all writers should read more books in translation for sure. There's just so much out there, and you just have to look for it. Yeah.
That's a
This is the book
fantastic
I'm
answer.
currently reading that is uh, a lot of it's Chinese short stories. The Way
Mhm,
Spring Arrives. It was published by Tor, I think.
mhm.
Yes, Tor.com. I'm working my way through this right now. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's a book of shame for me because my friend has a book club, and I was like, "Oh, I'll join," and
Yeah.
then didn't get to it. But
Yeah, it
but I
happens.
110% agree with the idea of translation being
Mhm,
important. Something, coming from living in Japan for
mhm,
as long as I have at this point, um, I have made it an effort to read a lot of Japanese translated
mhm,
fiction while I'm here. And something that strikes me too is not just on the line level, but also on the plot structure level, how
mhm,
different writing
yep,
is in this country. And I'm sure it's
mhm,
different from other places where I'm not as well read. But the idea of the dynamic action that,
mhm.
curve that in with the West we all tend to follow is not really so much a thing here. And
Yeah,
I find as a reader, it challenges me. So not only as a writer should we expand, but as a reader as
mhm,
well, I think it's important for people to be branching outside of that structure.
mhm,
Because I feel also as a writer, I imagine you can take techniques from that, from the different ways that people approach plot structure
mhm.
around the world and add it to your own work as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the goal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Tessa, and again, you are now, you're, I know essentially we're all writers and it's one big creative space, but now you're straddling both the traditionally published and the self-published world. You mentioned that you've
Mhm,
self-published some books. Self-publishing, I think is I talked about, what kind of books, are we missing? What kind of books would we like to see? I think self-publishing has really changed the game in terms
mhm.
of access to such a wide variety of
Yep.
books that might not have reached certain audiences, but now it can because authors don't have to, go through, essentially
Mhm,
the gauntlet of a big traditional publishing house.
mhm,
So, what's it like now to have, kind of a foot in both, to have self-published works? You probably might not have envisioned that one day you'd, be a New York Times best-selling author, traditionally, and then you'd have self-published books as well. So, where do what's that like? Where do you see the whole industry going with the proliferation of self-published books and traditionally published? Like, where's that all going? You have a kind of a great inside track. Um,
I think that, well, first of all, I don't really consider that I like straddle both worlds because I did self-publish the US Asgard trilogy, um, but I really hated it. And I don't enjoy indie publishing because I don't like marketing and I don't like doing all of the stuff that is really important to be a successful indie author. um, when I self-publish something now, it's like a short story that I just throw up on my website and I'm like, hey, everybody go read this on my website. So I am a very bad example of an um, indie writer. That said, I think that um, probably other than the economy, and the pandemic is included in the economy. The last 8 years of really strong pushes for diverse books and indie publishing are the three things that have actually shifted how traditional publishing works in the last 10 years. Um, and like, because indie publishing is directly to readers. I mean, there's, the most successful indie writers are people who have the resources to devote time and energy and money to building themselves a platform and getting their books out to readers. So there's still a lot of like, the structural hierarchy of it's, privileged white people in particular have those resources, so it's still really skewed, but there's still a direct access to readers, and not just what readers want, but readers realizing, oh, I didn't even know I wanted this. And that's something that I don't think traditional publishing has ever been good at, is that, oh, I didn't know I wanted this. But you know who's really good at that is indie romance and erotica writers. um, and they really have learned how to push the needle on finding these tropes and repeatable ideas that readers want, and learning how to market directly to those readers, and then getting bigger and better to the point where they end up on TikTok. And I don't think that TikTok would be what it is without indie publishing at all. Even though currently the biggest TikTok books are traditionally published books, they weren't always, and even those writers come from hybrid places. So it was not very long ago where traditionally published writers easily could look down their noses at indie writers. And now the only ones who do that are the ones who are so successful they don't have to care about anything, or not seeing the rising waters. Yeah. I
Yeah.
I hope I can always be a traditionally published writer, because like I said, I'm not good at, nor do I enjoy trying to become good at indie publishing. But if you are good at that, do it. I mean, it's a great place to be.
Well, obviously, you've had so much success as a traditional published author. There's no reason
Ups
what
and downs, ups and downs.
yeah, yeah, obviously, but ultimately, I
Yeah.
would argue, obviously, that's for you to
Yeah.
evaluate. But as an outsider, I
Mhm.
would say, looking, on the outside and saying, lots of success, right? Of
Yeah.
course, now you talked about hybrid. I think that's a really important word. We have
Mhm.
so many instances of authors going back and forth,
Mhm.
publishing, being traditionally published and saying, you know what, I have this series I always want to write. I'm not sure if my editor would go for this. I'm not sure if my agent can sell this. I'm just
Yeah.
going to self-publish it.
Right.
And, and as well. And you have authors that make the transition.
Mhm.
We had the pleasure of having Travis Baldry on the show, right? Another New York Times
Mhm.
bestselling author, published Legends and Lattes, Cozy
Uh-huh.
Fantasy,
Yeah.
self-published, blew up because of that, got a book deal, New
Mhm.
York Times bestselling author. Like, so there's so much more of that mixing and matching. Will
Yeah.
White, strict self-pub, New York
Mhm.
Times bestselling author, the industry's
Yeah.
really changing with that.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm really good friends with Sierra Simone, who writes indie romance and erotica. And she has a deal where I think it's with Source Books. They are repackaging some of her backlist and publishing them in like paperback. And then with the rest of that series, Sierra is indie publishing the ebooks, but they are still publishing the paperbacks. And so it's like directly hybridized with a traditional publisher. So, like, theoretically, everybody wins kind of thing, because she doesn't have to deal with the material and doing those uh the paperbacks, like the hard copies kind of thing. But yeah, like then there are more and more deals like that.
I mean, that would be smart for traditional publishers to try to get,
Mhm.
you know, get
Yeah.
dip their fingers in there, because I find I'm hearing a lot of people, like even with Spiffbo, the self-published fantasy
Uh-huh.
blog off, the winners of those can be approached, by traditional publishing.
Mhm.
And I've heard some people discuss that almost as poaching, like whoever makes it to the top. But I'm very glad to hear that there's exploration of, a hybrid way
Mhm.
to approach this. That really gives me a lot of hope for bridging between the two.
Yeah.
Because, we often say on this show that there's room for everyone. Books are not a finite resource. It really is. If there's readers, which there are, then there's room for
Mhm.
your story. So it's nice to see kind of the rising tide
Yeah.
together.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
I was going to ask Tessa, you may not be able to disclose everything, but can you tell us anything about any new projects you're working on or what might you have in the hopper kind of thing?
Justina and I just turned in the second draft of the sequel to Chaos and Flame. That comes out next May, I believe. We also just turned in another co-written Star Wars. It's for Phase 3 of the High Republic. I'm currently writing another solo Star Wars, and this is an adult one. I'm really excited to write an adult Star Wars book. It's called Temptation of the Force, and it comes out sometime in 2024. But I'm still writing
Sounds
that.
spicy.
So yeah, I
I
know.
like that
I'm
title.
excited.
Yeah.
Um, and I am on submission with a new adult fantasy that I hope sells, but who knows in this economy. So yeah, right now everything I have coming out is Star Wars and then Chaos and Flame, and I'm hoping to sell some other stuff that is all secret because it's still on submission and everything. So working on my own um, standalone YA fantasy again. But yeah, I think that's everything. I have
That's a lot.
yeah, I know.
So that's a lot of projects in the works.
Yeah. And it's really the Star Wars, the timeline is so fast. Usually when I am working on a book, it's not going to come out for like 2 or 3 years. But with Star Wars, I'm literally writing a book that's going to come out next year. And that is part of the Star Wars pressure. But yeah, that also keeps everything very like in time, like in real time, and what people are excited about, that's what we're given. So
Well, it's certainly going to make you quite the prolific author. And looking back, your body of work over a 5-10 year
yeah,
span going forward is going to be pretty extensive. So,
it
uh,
is. I'm gonna need a vacation.
well, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to
No,
put
no.
extra pressure on you, but acquiring minds want to know. I know it may be a no go, and you may have done with that, but is there any possibility you might ever come back to Innislayer? I know it's a duology, and it's amazing. It stands alone, but is there any possibility you might do something
I
else
would
with?
I would love to. Those books lived in my head for a long time before I wrote them. And so it would need to be the right play and the right time. I'd love to, though. I'm very open to the universe and publishing presenting me with the opportunity to write a third Innis Lear book. Yeah. Yeah.
Purely a
Please just
selfish
make
question.
PL's day.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
I just
If I had to do it right now, I would probably this is going to be a ridiculous answer, but unsurprisingly, of the two plays I would pick, one of them would be 12th Night, and the other one, brace yourself, would be Titus.
Titus. Wow.
Yes.
Okay. So I thought Titus Andronicus for sure.
Uh-huh.
I thought you might have said Othello. I wasn't sure you're going to go that route, but
Yeah.
I wow, that's
Yeah.
exciting.
Could
That's
be,
exciting.
but yeah,
That's exciting.
Titus.
That's exciting. Wow.
Mhm.
I'm there for it. Sign me up.
I've been
I'm
a
there
real
for it.
fan of Aaron the character Aaron in Titus Andronicus since the first time I think I saw that play before I read it, which is probably a good thing. Yeah.
I have this old, really completely beat up, covers falling off, uh, Shakespeare. What for? It's from my mom gave it to me. I'm
Mm-hmm.
54, and I got it like in elementary school. So I don't. This is a 40. The book itself is probably about 70 years old, but I've had it for about
Yeah.
40 years,
Yeah.
and it is. I refuse to get rid of it. Like it's literally falling apart. The glue is coming. Like the pages are unglued, but it's just dear to me. So because I love Shakespeare, and
Yeah.
it's just something near to my heart. And I grew like you. I grew up, really loving his work, and
Mm-hmm.
like you, as you get older and you understand different things, having problems with certain things. But like you
Mm-hmm.
said, the Bard was in some ways very much ahead of his time
Yeah.
for what he wrote, and I always say that he's also in some ways he's one of the not original, but he's one of the earlier historical fiction writers and or historical fantasy writers that
Mm-hmm.
you can find out there, and
Yep.
he's good. He's
Yeah.
good. So
Yeah.
so again, I am excited to hear that you might potentially.
I'd love to. Yeah. I'd absolutely love to.
Well, the time always goes so fast. We are already over an hour here, but
Oh
I
yeah.
hope you don't mind indulging me with one question that is not directly book related, but it's something
Okay.
that you have on your website and something you also mentioned in your intro, which is that you've been lucky to live around the world, even though now
Mm-hmm.
you've kind of settled in Kansas for the moment. But I'm just curious, as someone else who loves travel and seeing the world, do you have a favorite place that you've been? And has that place inspired any of your works?
Um, Gosh, I'm one of those lucky people where I really love the landscape where I am at the moment. And so when it comes to like actual land, I love everything because if I'm on the prairie, I love the prairie. If I'm by the ocean, it's the ocean. If it's mountain, it's mountains. But when it comes to actual places, my two favorite cities, um, like outside of America, I love so many cities in America. Um, I would say Budapest, which was a total surprise for me. My wife and I, when we were backpacking as like 20-year-olds, we had like one afternoon in Budapest because we were waiting for a train to go somewhere else. And we were just like, oh my God, the city's so cool. We ended up staying there for 3 days. We had done no research on the city. So we really just wandered around the city and we found some of the most incredible, weird stuff in that city. And I haven't been back there since 2000. It was it was 2001. The summer of 2001 is when we were there for only 3 days, but it is just etched into my memory as like the perfect travel experience where you're young and, we had $2 a day and it was just still so great. And we explored so much and discovered so much. And then my other favorite city is Kyoto in Japan. Uh, I was born in Okinawa, and I no memories of that because I was an infant. But I have always had a lot of pictures of what it was like. I was my parents' first kid, and so they were youths also, and they dragged me all across those islands, and I have pictures of me in a variety of places in Kyoto. And then I lived just south of Tokyo for 3 years when I was a teenager, which was absolutely formative for all the reasons I'm sure you can imagine. Um, and Kyoto, though, I've been back to and, got to go revisit those places and recreate the pictures from when I was a tiny little baby with my dad. And I love the feel of that city. And one of my favorite things about Japan is how Like in America, you can't throw a rock without hitting a church. Well, it's the same in Japan, only they're Shinto and Buddhist shrines. And they're just it's so the same and so different on like a really cool world building way. The way that religion like weaves into the history of the cities and how they were built and where things were allowed to be built and all that kind of stuff. And then there's just so much poetry in Japan in general, but also in Kyoto. And I really love that, like being on a bus and like driving past some things like, oh, I think that's a poem. Just sitting there on the side of the road, those kind of things. So yeah, my favorite cities, I would need to go back to Budapest, which I'd love to do before I could really let it specifically influence me. The experience of being, a stranger in a city and accidentally discovering it, that sense has definitely permeated a lot of my work. I don't think I could divorce Japan and the influence it's had on me from my writing, because being in Japan as a teenager and coming into like I was basically radicalized in Japan because of the things that were going on politically in the 90s in Japan, made it really fraught. And the Japanese people were really starting to fight back with protests about the American occupation of their island. And so I was there as a teenager and experienced a lot of I fraught moments where I was like, "Oh my god, are we the bad guys?" Oh wow, we are the bad guys. And that just has influenced my whole life and how I feel about international politics and globalization and all these things. Um, but I did let the aesthetics of what I love about Japan really creep into my work on Night Shine and Moondark Smile in particular. There's a lot about the way that I wrote the demons and spirits and shrines and magic. And it takes place in a like a temperate rainforest, which part of Japan is. So yeah, with volcanoes.
Such a beautiful answer. I haven't been to Budapest
Thanks.
myself, but but you make me want to go there.
Yeah. It's a very
um,
cool city. At least it was in 2001. I assume it's still pretty great.
we can safely assume.
Yeah. Yeah.
I also just wanted to apologize to those who left a chat earlier. I was engaged in the conversation. I didn't put them up, but we just had a couple people stop by. So, hi, I don't know if you're still here, but thank you so much for stopping by. And Derek is also here. All right. So, as I mentioned, though, this goes so fast. So, I don't want to take too much more
Sure.
of your time. Before we go, though, if people want to find you and your work and look for future updates, where can they find you? Where can they look for you?
Twitter is where I am the most often, though I will warn you, 80% of my Twitter is my current fandom, which is Chinese web novels. So there's a lot of fan art and like inside jokes on my Twitter, but I do also post about my books there. And my Instagram, they're both at Tessa Gratton. And then the best place is my website, really, tessagratton.com. I update that, and you can sign up for my newsletter on my website. So that is supposed to be monthly, but it's really every other month ish. But that'll come directly to your inbox if you sign up for my newsletter. So, yeah.
Wonderful. And for PL, where can people find you if they would like to locate you in the future?
Uh, Oftentimes beside Taylor and Steve for page chewing, which where we have wonderful guests like Tessa. For the books, it's www.plstore.com. That's the website. Social media preferred platform. I'm on Facebook and Instagram, but Twitter is where I hang out the most. That's where you can find me at PL Stewart Writes. And of course, again, I am a member of the the Tessa Gratton fan club. So I can't wait to read much more of Tessa's work. So
thank you.
And if you have somehow stumbled upon this video and you don't know who I am, my name is Taylor. My channel is Made Between the Pages. That's what you're on right now. And this is the best place to find me. All of my links to my Twitter and all of that are down below in the description. So once again, thank you so much for joining us, Tessa. This is a delightful conversation, and I feel like you've given me so much to think about and marinate on.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad. Yeah, it was really fun. Thank you. I'm always happy to talk on and on and on about Shakespeare and Japan in particular. So.
Well, clearly we're in the right place then, because you've got a host for each of those. Thank you so much to everyone who stopped by in the chat and everyone who's watching this after. We really appreciate your engagement. You are the people who make Page Chewing what it is. But for today, I think we're going to head out and we'll see you guys on the next episode. See you.